It was supposed to be a quiet drive home through the Mississippi countryside. Solomon Brooks, a retired 68-year-old, had spent the weekend with his grandchildren and was heading back to Greenville in his spotless Navy SUV. The late afternoon sun cast golden shadows across the road as Sam Cooke played gently through the speakers. Solomon wasn't in a rush. He never was anymore. Dressed in a navy blazer, crisp white shirt, and polished shoes, Solomon looked every bit the dignified man he was. He carried himself with grace, the type earned through decades of hard work and quiet resistance. But as he drove through the pine-lined backroads, something in his rearview mirror made him tense. A sheriff's cruiser slowly pulling out from behind a tree line. At first, he tried to ignore it. He hadn't broken any laws. No speeding, no broken lights, no swerving. Still, the way the cruiser tailed him raised a familiar discomfort. It wasn't fear exactly. It was memory. A memory of being watched too closely for all the wrong reasons. The cruiser's lights finally flashed. Solomon sighed and pulled over. He placed both hands on the wheel, steady, deliberate. This wasn't his first roadside encounter, but something told him this one would be different. Much different. Deputy Roy Halford sat behind the wheel of the cruiser, squinting toward the SUV with a look of distaste. Nice car. Out-of-state tags. Bet it's stolen, he muttered. His partner, Trevor Banks, a rookie fresh from the academy, glanced at him nervously. He's driving the speed limit. Plates are clean, Trevor offered. Roy scoffed. You trust plates now? I know the type. Trevor didn't respond. He was still learning when to speak and when silence was safer. But deep inside, something felt off already. The red and blue lights snapped on and Roy stepped out, his boots crunching on the gravel. Stay in the car unless I say otherwise, he told Trevor. There was a smirk in his tone. This wasn't a stop. It was a performance. One he'd done too many times before. As Roy approached the SUV, Solomon rolled down the window with calm precision. Good afternoon, officer, he said in a smooth, steady voice. Roy barely acknowledged the greeting. License and registration, he snapped, already assuming guilt. Solomon moved carefully, slowly. No sudden gestures. His right hand opened the glove box while the left stayed in plain sight. He handed over his documents without resistance. Roy read the name. Solomon Brooks. What brings you out here, Mr. Brooks? Just heading home, Solomon answered. Spent the weekend with family in Hattiesburg. Roy raised an eyebrow. You always drive a car like this? Solomon gave a thin smile. He didn't bother answering that. We've had trouble on this road. Carjackings. Drugs. You understand, Roy said. Solomon looked him squarely in the eye. No, I don't. But I'm listening. That calm reply, measured, respectful, infuriated Roy more than it should have. Step out of the vehicle, Roy barked. Is there a reason, deputy? Solomon asked. Just procedure, Roy replied. Solomon sighed, unlocked the door, and stepped out, moving with dignity. Taller than Roy and exuding quiet strength, he stood on solid ground. Roy didn't like that at all. Roy ordered Solomon to place his hands on the SUV's hood. Solomon asked, On what legal grounds? Roy growled, Because I told you to. From the cruiser, Trevor shifted uncomfortably. Sir, maybe we should. Roy shot him a glare. Stay in the car, rookie. Solomon didn't resist. He turned and complied, letting his hands rest on the warm metal. Roy patted him down, rough and forceful, not looking for danger, looking to demean. He found nothing. No surprise. Frustrated, Roy opened the passenger door and began searching the vehicle without permission. Deputy, Solomon warned, you're conducting a search without consent. Roy waved it off. Officer safety. But even Trevor could tell this was far from protocol. Trevor stepped out of the cruiser, heart pounding. Sir, he hasn't done anything wrong. He's complied with everything. Roy snapped back. Get in the car, Banks. That's an order. But Trevor didn't move. And that was the beginning of everything unraveling. Roy moved to the trunk, pulling at the handle. It was locked. He glared at Solomon. Open it. Solomon remained calm. If you believe you have probable cause, get your warrant. That challenge was like gasoline to Roy's fire. Red-faced, Roy stomped back to the driver's side. From Trevor's angle, he saw something strange. Roy crouched low, a flash of plastic in his hand. Then, a clear bag of white powder was slipped under the driver's seat. Trevor's breath caught in his chest. Roy stood tall and loud. Well, would you look at that? He held the bag high like a trophy. You're under arrest for possession. Solomon turned slowly. That's not mine. You planted it. The crowd that had gathered was watching, filming, murmuring. Roy smirked. Think you're smart, huh? Solomon didn't flinch. No, deputy, but the truth is. And with that, the real battle had just begun. Trevor Banks stood frozen by the cruiser door, heart pounding in his ears. He had just seen something that wasn't supposed to happen. Not in training, not in real life. A senior officer, his mentor, had planted evidence. And now that lie was becoming law right in front of him. His gut twisted. This wasn't about procedure. This wasn't safety. It was a show, a setup, and the man at the center of it wasn't resisting, wasn't panicking. Solomon Brooks just stood there with a stillness that demanded truth. Trevor could barely breathe. Are you sure you want to do this, deputy? Solomon asked again. Roy didn't answer with words. He shoved Solomon against the SUV and began the arrest. The crowd gasped. Phones zoomed in. Still, Trevor didn't move until something in him snapped. Sir, he said, stepping forward, voice trembling, I saw what you did. I saw you plant that bag. The entire scene froze. Roy turned slowly, fury burning in his eyes. You accusing me, rookie? Trevor didn't back down. I'm saying we need to report this. The truth needs to come out. More people had gathered now. Drivers who'd pulled over, passers-by who sensed something wasn't right. They weren't just bystanders anymore. They were witnesses. Cameras held high, phones recording everything. The silence became thick, like thunder waiting to crack. Roy looked around, realizing for the first time how exposed he was. His usual shield, fear, wasn't working. Not this time. The eyes on him weren't afraid. They were resolute. And Trevor Banks, the rookie, had just publicly defied him. I'll have your badge for this, Roy hissed. But his voice cracked, his hands no longer steady. He tried to regain control, barking orders, threatening to arrest everyone for obstruction. But nobody flinched. The crowd stood its ground. Then came the sirens, backup called in by Roy himself. But now they weren't there to support him. They were stepping into a scene already unraveling. 2 officers arrived, tense, eyes scanning the standoff. What's going on here? One asked. The weight of the answer hung in the air. The atmosphere shifted when a black SUV pulled up, unmarked but unmistakable. Out stepped Lieutenant Carla Jenkins, veteran of the force, respected, tough, unshakable. She didn't speak at first, just looked at the scene, taking everything in, Solomon, Trevor, Roy, the crowd. Her eyes narrowed on Roy, then on the bag in his hand. Everyone take a breath, she said calmly. Now someone tell me what the hell is going on. Trevor stepped forward. His voice was steady now, despite the tremble in his fingers. Ma'am, I need to make a formal statement. I witnessed Deputy Halford plant that evidence. The crowd erupted, not in chaos, but in relief. Cries of "we saw it too" filled the air. Roy tried to push back. That's a damn lie. But Jenkins wasn't having it. Is it? Because I see 10 phones pointed right at you, deputy. You sure you want to call it a lie? She held out her hand. Give me the evidence. Roy hesitated. Now, slowly, with rage trembling in his jaw, Roy handed over the bag. The shift in power was undeniable. The truth had begun to speak, and it wasn't going away. Lieutenant Jenkins slipped the evidence into a sealed pouch. Internal Affairs will take it from here, she said firmly. Turn in your weapon and your badge. Roy's face turned pale. You're suspending me? Jenkins nodded. You're lucky I'm not cuffing you right now. The crowd murmured. Some pulled out phones for better shots. Roy looked from face to face, seeing no support, only judgment. Then his eyes landed on Trevor. You did this, he growled. But Trevor stood firm. No, sir. You did. With a bitter glare, Roy unhooked his weapon, dropped his badge into Jenkins' hand, and stormed off. The crowd parted in silence. No jeers, no applause, just the heavy realization that a wall had cracked, and no one knew what would come through. Solomon stood beside his SUV, unmoving. His eyes followed Roy until he disappeared into the trees. Then he simply exhaled, one long breath, the kind a man holds when he knows danger has passed, but not the fight. Not yet. A week later, Solomon stood on the steps of the courthouse, flanked by attorneys and surrounded by cameras. "This isn't just about me," he said into a dozen microphones. "It's about every citizen who's ever been profiled, harassed, and silenced, and told to take it." The lawsuit was official now. Civil charges against Roy Halford and the sheriff's department had been filed. But more than that, a movement was taking root. Donations came in. Retired judges offered pro bono counsel. Churches, schools, community leaders all joined the call for reform. Inside the department, Trevor Banks was learning what truth costs. Some colleagues shook his hand. Others ignored him. A few scowled openly. One day, he opened his locker to find "rat" written inside in red marker. Another day, his car tires were slashed in the parking lot. But Jenkins didn't flinch. She called a mandatory department meeting. Any retaliation against Deputy Banks will be met with suspension or termination, she warned. He followed the law. He did the right thing, and more of you should try it. Solomon tried to return to normal life, but normal had shifted. One night, he came home to find his mailbox smashed into pieces. 2 days later, a brick crashed through his front window at 2 a.m. The cameras he'd installed after the incident, conveniently offline during both events. Then came the letters, typed, folded, no return address. "We know what you did. You're not safe. Next time, you won't walk away." Solomon said nothing to his daughter. She had enough to worry about. But inside, he knew what this meant. Roy wasn't done. Meanwhile, Trevor noticed a black pickup truck following him from the station. Once. Twice. No plates, same dent. One night, it idled outside his apartment for 20 minutes before peeling off when he stepped outside. Another night, he came home to find his uniform shirt sliced down the middle and laid across his bed. He filed a report, but the silence in the department was suffocating. The atmosphere had changed. Eyes lingered. Conversations stopped when he entered a room. Even Jenkins, as tough as she was, could feel the walls closing in. The message was clear. Truth had a price. At a community event on racial justice, Solomon spoke with conviction. The audience clapped. Some even cried. It was late when he left, and he didn't see the SUV with its lights off behind him until it was too late. First a nudge, then a hard hit. His car spun out, crashing into a ditch. The airbag deployed. He was dazed but conscious. 3 men stepped out of the SUV, crowbars in hand. One opened his door, sneering. "Still think you're a hero?" Solomon reached under his seat, not for a weapon, but for a voice recorder. He hit record. They dragged him out. "Any last words?" one asked, raising a crowbar. But before the strike could land, headlights lit up the scene, blinding, urgent. Tires screeched. A truck came roaring toward them. The attackers froze. Out stepped Trevor Banks, gun drawn. "Get away from him," he shouted. 2 fled. 1 dropped to his knees. Trevor ran to Solomon's side. "You with me?" he asked, voice shaking. Solomon coughed, blood on his lip. "Told you," he rasped. "They don't quit." But neither would he. The attack made national headlines. Dashcam footage from Trevor's vehicle, though grainy, confirmed everything. The SUV, the masked men, the crowbar raised in the air. The rookie officer stepping into the light. It was undeniable. Protests erupted in Jackson, Biloxi, across the Deep South. People marched in silence with duct tape over their mouths. "Justice for Brooks" signs sprouted in yards and on storefronts. The public wasn't just outraged, they were mobilized. And they weren't going away. Lieutenant Jenkins launched a full internal audit. Every officer who had worked with Roy Halford in the past 5 years was investigated. Disciplinary records, missing body cam footage, buried complaints, everything came under scrutiny. The findings were staggering. Roy wasn't an isolated case. He was part of a quiet network of officers known as the gatekeepers. They shared racist jokes, covered each other's misconduct, and passed down a culture of silence. And now, that silence was being shattered. 3 officers were immediately suspended. 2 more placed on leave. One resigned the night before his hearing. The department was cracking open. But the deeper Jenkins dug, the more resistance she faced. The old guard wasn't going quietly. Trevor, now promoted to community integrity liaison, became a lightning rod. Online trolls mocked him. Rumors spread that he was being paid by activists. One morning, he opened his locker to find a dead rat nailed to the back wall. Another day, snitch was carved into his car door. He kept showing up. He did his job. Jenkins backed him at every turn. But the walls were still closing in. And Solomon? He refused to back down. Bruised, walking with a cane, he toured schools, churches, city halls. Justice isn't a privilege, he told crowds. It's a promise. Then came the legislation. With the help of lawyers and activists, Solomon drafted a bill, the Brooks Act. Body cams on all stops. Civilian oversight boards. Whistleblower protections. Mandatory bias training. Some called it radical. Solomon called it necessary. Not everyone wanted reform. The backlash hit hard. A sheriff from a nearby county went on national radio, calling the bill an insult to law enforcement. A police union rep warned it would paralyze patrols. The governor released a lukewarm statement of non-support. Then came the threats. Solomon's daughter found her car keyed from bumper to bumper. A brick shattered her living room window while she was putting her toddler to bed. No one saw anything. Again, the cameras were offline. Trevor's apartment was broken into. Nothing was stolen, but everything was touched. Drawers emptied. His father's military medal shattered in its frame. Family photos torn and scattered. The message was clear: we see you. But instead of retreating, Trevor showed up at the precinct earlier the next morning. They're trying to scare us, he told Jenkins. It's working, she admitted. Then Trevor shook his head. No, ma'am. It's making me angrier. Jenkins gave a tight nod. Good. Let's fight. One evening, Officer Maya Cortez found her patrol car vandalized outside a community center. The hood was scratched with deep gouges. A dead crow was nailed beneath the windshield wiper. On the passenger window, someone had spray painted in blood red, YOURENEXT. Lieutenant Jenkins didn't hesitate. That same night, she called a press conference. Cameras rolled as she stepped up to the microphone, her uniform immaculate, her tone iron. This is not resistance. This is domestic terrorism, and we will not be bullied into silence. The next morning, the Brooks Act was back in committee for vote. Word spread that it might pass. The pressure intensified. Anonymous threats poured into lawmakers' offices. Fake mugshots of senators appeared online. One lawmaker's wife received a direct threat. Your kids aren't safe. Still, momentum was building. The people weren't retreating. Supporters flooded the Capitol steps. Protesters slept outside the building. Solomon kept meeting with lawmakers one by one, asking the same question. When your grandchild asks what you did, what will you say? Trevor Banks had grown quieter, not from fear, but from focus. He moved carefully now, checked his mirrors twice. One night, he got a call from an old academy buddy. The voice was hushed, almost paranoid. They're gonna kill the bill, man. I heard it. They're rigging the vote. They reshuffled the committee last minute. Trevor brought the warning straight to Jenkins. She in turn called Solomon. At dawn, he was already at the state capitol. No cameras, no speeches, just a man in a navy coat walking from office to office, reminding lawmakers that change wasn't a threat, it was a duty. By midday, 3 committee members had flipped. The bill was back on track. But that night, someone keyed his daughter's car again, this time etching liar into the hood. Then someone shattered the front window of her house. She had just put her baby to sleep. Solomon didn't hesitate. He hired private security. He doubled patrols. But he knew the message. They weren't just trying to stop the bill. They were trying to break his will. And if they had to go through his family to do it, they would. Inside the police department, the pressure escalated. Trevor came to work one morning to find his front door glued shut. Duct taped to the window. Next time it's fire. He peeled it off, fists clenched, then walked straight to Jenkins' office. They think we'll fold, he said. Maya's car was targeted again. This time, someone left a plastic bag filled with red liquid on the passenger seat. Inside it, a piece of paper, one bullet. One truth. She didn't flinch. She showed up at the next school event anyway. leading a workshop on civil rights and policing. Jenkins wasn't idle either. She filed for federal support. The FBI began shadowing her team. Patrol routes were changed. Protection was increased around Solomon's home and his daughters. But no one knew where the next hit would come from or how far they'd go. And yet, none of them backed down. "You don't get to terrorize people into silence," Solomon said during a televised town hall. "Because if fear wins, we all lose. And I didn't survive 68 years to start losing now." Then came the leak. An anonymous whistleblower sent a series of screenshots to a national reporter. It was from a private group chat, over 30 officers from multiple counties. The content was vile: racist slurs, jokes about planting drugs, memes mocking Solomon's cane. One message stood out like fire: "Let's see if the rookie still talks without his vest." They'd been watching Trevor, waiting, laughing, and now the world could see it too. The reporter went live with the story. Within hours, it exploded online. Jenkins moved fast. Officers named in the chat were suspended. Some resigned. A few were arrested for obstruction and conspiracy. The Attorney General launched a statewide investigation. But public reaction outpaced policy. People took to the streets in droves. They weren't just marching for Solomon anymore. They were marching for every time this had happened in silence. For every case with no cameras. For every voice that never got to testify. And this time, they refused to look away. Solomon boarded a plane to Washington, D.C. for the first time in years. Not for sightseeing, for truth. He carried with him every report, every video, every screenshot. He sat across from Justice Department officials and laid it all out. "This isn't just a Mississippi issue," he said. "This is national rot, and you can't wait for someone else to clean it up." His calm tone didn't mask his urgency. "We need federal oversight, a misconduct registry, national whistleblower protection, and we need it now." Back home, tensions remain high. A burned SUV was found abandoned near Solomon's neighborhood. No plates, no tags. Inside, a list of names: Solomon, Trevor, Maya, Jenkins, written in red across the top. "We remember." Jenkins increased security again. Trevor slept with his service weapon next to the bed. Maya began checking her tires before every shift. Solomon never parked without backing into the driveway, headlights out. But none of them stopped, because the storm wasn't over, and they were still standing. The day finally arrived. Roy Halford was going to trial. The charges were severe: evidence tampering, false arrest, assault, obstruction of justice, abuse of power, and misconduct under color of law. 6 charges, each one a mirror to a broken system. The courtroom was packed. Reporters lined the back wall. Community members filled every seat. Retired officers sat alongside teachers, pastors, and students. Some came in disbelief. Most came for justice. And in the front row sat Solomon Brooks, silent, resolute, a man who refused to be erased. Trevor sat beside him, his suit neat, hands folded, but trembling. This was the moment they had fought toward. Every threat, every headline, every night of fear had led to this. The air was heavy with consequence. The prosecution began with precision. Dashcam footage, civilian videos, the recovered voice recording. A forensic analysis proving Roy's fingerprints were on the planted bag. None from Solomon. The jury leaned in. Even the judge seemed unable to look away. One by one, the witnesses took the stand. A mother who had stopped to film the scene testified. She saw Roy reach into his pocket before leaning into the SUV. A teenager said he'd recorded the entire stop and still had nightmares about it. Then Solomon took the stand. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't dramatize. "This wasn't just racial profiling," he said. "It was an attempt to erase me, to make me feel like I didn't matter." He looked directly at the jury. "But I do, and so does the truth." Trevor followed. He told them what he saw, how it felt to watch it happen, and how it broke something inside him. "If I had stayed quiet," he said, "I would have been just as guilty." His voice shook, but his message was crystal. The defense tried to spin. They called Roy a decorated officer under stress. They painted Solomon as political, called Trevor too young, too easily manipulated. But the jury had seen the footage, had heard the voices. had watched the truth unfold in real time. The closing arguments were swift. The judge gave her instructions. The jury left the room. Outside, supporters lit candles. Inside, Solomon and Trevor sat side by side, silent. It didn't take long, just over 2 hours. The jury returned. The clerk read the verdict, guilty, on all 6 counts. The room didn't erupt. It exhaled, as if the weight of months, years, had finally lifted. Roy Halford sat stone-faced, but his clenched jaw gave him away. He knew it was over. Bail is denied, the judge declared. A deputy stepped forward and cuffed Roy at the defense table. The man who once held power in his fists now walked through the courtroom as a prisoner. No applause, just justice. Solomon didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He simply closed his eyes and breathed. Beside him, Trevor sat up straighter, eyes wet. For the first time in months, the system hadn't looked away. It had looked inward and said the word out loud, guilty. In the 24 hours following the verdict, the ripple effect spread statewide. Police departments sent out quiet memos reminding officers to follow protocol. Some scrambled to locate paperwork. Others began reviewing procedures. But everyone knew what it really meant. Fear. Lieutenant Jenkins didn't stop. She filed formal audit requests to the state inspector general. She asked for traffic stop data, use of force logs, and body cam footage from every department in the region. What came back was damning. Entire departments had gone years without uploading any body cam footage. Dozens of complaints had never been investigated. Minority drivers were pulled over 4 times more often than white drivers, yet received no higher rate of citations or arrests. Solomon looked over the numbers in silence. He didn't need statistics to validate his experience, but now he had proof, and proof is power. He organized a public town hall and stood in front of a projector screen. They told us it was a few bad apples, he said, but the orchard's been poisoned. The backlash was swift, not from the public, but from within. One officer was caught on camera shredding documents late at night. Another went on radio and called Solomon's team deep state actors. But the fear was visible now. The old guard was exposed. Jenkins arrived at her office one morning to find an envelope with a single bullet inside. No note, just a message. Trevor's apartment was broken into again. This time, his files were burned in the sink. Maya found her front door spray painted in blood. Leave or bleed. Then came the ultimate exposure. A leaked group chat of over 30 officers filled with threats, racist slurs, and references to Trevor and Solomon by name. It had been active for over a year. No one had reported it. No one had stopped it. The streets filled again, not just with protest, but with purpose. We believe you, one sign read. And we're watching. The old shield of silence had cracked. Now, the light was pouring through the holes, and no one could pretend not to see. Solomon didn't stop at state lines. He flew back to Washington and sat once again before DOJ officials, this time with even more to share: screenshots, testimony, verified audit reports, and a burning truth. This isn't isolated. This is national, he told them, and it's been allowed to grow in silence. He called for a national misconduct registry, mandatory body cams in all departments, and federal funding for officer whistleblower protections. He wasn't just presenting facts. He was delivering a roadmap for reform. And they listened. News networks shifted their tone. Politicians from both parties began quoting Solomon in speeches. Civil rights leaders called his story a landmark moment. He had become a symbol, reluctantly, humbly, but undeniably. But back home, danger hadn't disappeared. A burnout SUV was found on the edge of town. Inside, a list of names: Solomon, Trevor, Maya, Jenkins, scrawled in red marker. Across the top, it read, "We remember. The fight wasn't over." But neither were they. Despite the threats, Solomon kept moving. He toured college campuses, held workshops in courthouses and high schools. He taught law students and young officers alike. The law isn't just a shield, he told them. It can be a weapon for justice, if you're brave enough to use it. Trevor stayed on the force. He didn't transfer. He didn't run. He stayed right where it began, training new recruits, leading de-escalation workshops, showing footage not of arrests but of accountability. A good cop doesn't need to be feared, he told cadets. He needs to be trusted. Maya took a different path. She left the force and founded Shield and Light, a nonprofit that offered mental health support for whistleblowers and law enforcement. You can't speak truth to power if you're drowning in silence, she told her first group. And Jenkins? She stayed just long enough to see the Brooks Act implemented. On her last day, she visited Solomon's office, hugged him, and whispered, "We held the line." Solomon nodded, tears in his eyes. Now we build something better. The vote came down to the wire. Just 3 votes separated the bill from defeat. But in the end, the Brooks Act passed. The Capitol chambers erupted. Protesters outside cheered and wept. Journalists rushed to file breaking headlines. Inside, Solomon didn't raise his fist. He simply closed his eyes and whispered, "Thank you," not to the lawmakers, but to everyone who stood with him, every voice that refused to be silenced. This wasn't just a win. It was a beginning. The law brought sweeping change. Statewide oversight boards, body cam mandates, whistleblower protections, racial profiling audits, and mandatory training funded directly by the state. Departments that once ignored reform now scrambled to comply. It wasn't perfect. It didn't erase centuries of bias. But it was real, tangible, alive. And for the first time in a long time, justice felt less like a dream and more like a direction. You could see it in the classrooms. Students now studied real traffic stop footage and asked real questions. You could hear it in town halls, where people finally stood up without fear. And you could feel it in courtrooms, where judges now asked for officer records before accepting their testimony. Solomon became more than a name. He became a symbol etched into civic education and community trust. A lecture series at the University of Mississippi was named after him. A scholarship for aspiring black law students bore his name, funded by supporters and even some former officers. Trevor, now a sergeant, continued mentoring young officers. "You're not here to control people," he said. "You're here to protect their rights, no matter what they look like." He used his own story as a warning and a hope. And Maya's nonprofit expanded across the South. Departments once hostile to reform now reached out for help. Officers who had buried guilt were finally coming forward, sharing stories in rooms built for healing. A new chapter had begun. Not perfect, but better. Years later, Solomon still walked with a cane, but his steps never faltered. He continued visiting schools, small-town courtrooms, and legislative chambers. He never asked for monuments. He asked for motion. Change doesn't come from speeches, he said. It comes from showing up. One day, a child in a classroom raised her hand and asked, "Who was Solomon Brooks?" The teacher smiled and said, "He was the man who refused to stay silent." And in that silence, a truth echoed louder than any siren. Because Solomon's story wasn't just about one traffic stop. It was about integrity, about standing tall when others expect you to bend, about what happens when truth doesn't just whisper, it roars. So if you remember nothing else, remember this. The truth doesn't need permission to rise. Only people brave enough to carry it.